story I heard about this guy walking down a city street, and there's a fortune teller there on the street. And she yells out to the man as he walks by and says, "For $20, I'll tell you exactly what you'll be doing at this time tomorrow." And he turned and yelled back, said, "I'll give you $100 if you can tell me what I was doing at this time yesterday." So that's the approach Nebuchadnezzar took. So he brought these people in. They couldn't interpret, couldn't tell him what the dream was. And so they pushed back. They said, "No king has ever asked someone to do this kind of thing. If you'll tell us the dream, then we'll give you the interpretation." And of course, he refused to do that, and he was furious with this group. He decided to have them all destroyed. He was going to round them, all these wise men, and kill them all. He said, what good are they if they can't do what I need them to do? I'll just kill them all and start over. So he starts rounding them up. And Daniel and his friends are caught in this. And so they are rounded up. And he appealed and said, "Well, what's the urgency? What's going on?" And when he was told, he asked that they would ask the king to give him time and that he would interpret the dream for him. You see, Daniel and his three friends had prospered in this training because of their commitment to honoring God. And their wisdom and knowledge and learning just exceeded all the others. And Daniel was even given the ability to interpret dreams. So he was going to be able to use that. So the king honored the request, allowed Daniel a little bit of time so he and his friends go back to prayer and pray that God would give him the interpretation. And he does. So he goes before the king, and the king asks him, says, "Can you give me the dream and the interpretation?" And Daniel's very clear. No man could do this. But there is a God in heaven that interprets dreams. And he has made known to me in order to tell you the interpretation. So he describes the dream. And the dream is about this giant image, metallic image. So Daniel tells him that. The king knows he has this answer from God. And then proceeds to tell him the definition here, that this image represents kingdoms, beginning with the head of gold, which represents Babylon. Now, that of course pleased the king to know that he is the head and he is, this precious metal of gold, most valuable of all of the metals here. So he's pleased to hear that, and Daniel goes through the rest of the interpretation to make known to him what's going to happen after him. And of course, that's after his reign, and he's gone, and so it doesn't really concern him at that point. So you have a handout like this too, by the way. It's on the back of one of your handouts. And you see this image, and there's room there if you want to make notes as we go along. So as you follow in your Bibles too, you come down to verse 47, when Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges that truly your God is the God of gods. Now that's his first encounter with the living God, of who he really is. And we'll see it come up again when he has future encounters. So that was chapter 2. We'll talk more about those different kingdoms as we go along. So now we're down to chapter 3. Some 20 years has passed by from the prior chapter. Everything is going well. The king and his kingdom is prospering like crazy. And he has placed Daniel in charge of his really entire kingdom. in the affairs of it, and given the other three, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, important positions in his kingdom also. So things are going fine there, and Nebuchadnezzar decides to build this giant image that represents him and his kingdom. And they come up with this ordinance that says when they dedicate this image, that everyone would have to bow down and worship this image. And if they didn't, then they're going to be destroyed. So, apparently, Daniel is away on king's business doing something. He's not present. But the other three are, and of course, they were committed not to worship anyone or anything other than the one true living God. So, it was made known to the king. He brings them in and said, apparently you didn't understand. When you hear the music start, the horns sound and so forth, if you will bow down and worship this image, then all is well. And of course they couldn't do it, refused to do it. He was furious. And so, and under the penalty in this ordinance, they would be cast into a burning furnace and of course perish there in the furnace. But the king was so furious, he ordered that they heat the furnace 7 times what it normally is. Had these 3 individuals, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, bound, their guards took them up the incline to throw them into the top of this furnace. The heat was so intense that as they threw them in, the guards died from that intense heat. So the king was seated a comfortable distance away from the furnace where he could see the ground opening, watching what happens. And all of a sudden, he sees 4 individuals walking around in that furnace. And he was stunned. And he tried to get a little closer to yell out to them to come out of the furnace. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego walk out of the furnace completely unharmed. Their clothing still intact. Even the hairs on their head was not singed because of that heat. And they explained to the king that their God had protected them because they would not bow down and worship another image. So that was the king's second encounter with the living God. And he says here in verse 29, if you want to follow along, it says the king acknowledged that there is no other God who can deliver like this. And that, as I said, was his second encounter. All right, so that's the story given in chapter 3. Now we move down to chapter 4. Chapter 4, more time has gone by. Great success in this kingdom. And the king is filled with pride of what he thinks has accomplished. But he has a dream here. And this dream was about this giant tree that grew up, that could be seen throughout the kingdom, that grew up into the heavens. It was so wonderful, producing food for people that lived there, and the animals, provided shelter for animals and a place for the birds to rest in the limbs of the tree. It was a tremendous tree, but he didn't know what it meant. And so once again, he brings in wise men to tell him. This time he tells them the dream, because he had confidence now they wouldn't try to mislead him. And they couldn't answer it, couldn't tell him. So then Daniel comes in. And when he describes this dream to Daniel, Daniel's countenance fell. So the king says to him, Daniel, don't hold back. Even if it's bad, tell me what this dream represents. And so Daniel proceeds to describe the dream. Now in this chapter, Daniel's writing this, but what you'll see here is the king's personal testimony that he writes out, documents, and we're going to see how this plays out. Because he is told here that the interpretation of this dream is that the tree represents him and his kingdom. And there was a watcher seeing the tree, came down from heaven and said, chop down the tree. So that was the part that Daniel, of course, didn't like telling the king. But he did. He said, you're going to chop down the tree, and the tree will be destroyed for 7 seasons, 7 years. And then the roots that are left will sprout, and it'll start to grow back. So, of course, King Nebuchadnezzar is very disturbed to hear that. But nothing happened right away. 12 months go by. Still nothing had happened. And he's walking around his palace looking over this vast kingdom that he thinks he has created. And he starts pride just rises up again. And he says, look at this kingdom, how great it is that I have developed and rule over. And at that very hour, he was struck and his kingdom was taken away. What happened was his mind was changed from that of a man to that of an animal. It's what the medical profession nowadays would call something like lycanthropy, a mental disease, like you going insane. So he was driven from the castle, the city, and lived out in the wilderness like an animal, eating grass to survive. His hair would grow and mat and look awful. His fingernails would not be trimmed during that 7-year period. After 7 years, the Lord allows his reasoning to return, his understanding, and makes sure that he realizes that it's God that's doing that. And he is the one that's in charge. So as we look at some key verses here, you might look down to verse 34. He says that at the end of the time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes up to heaven, and my understanding returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. And that was his third encounter and the most serious with the living God. He says, for his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom from generation to generation. So he honors God. Hopefully, totally is the one true God. We don't know for sure, but he certainly understands the power that God has and who he is at that point. All right, so that's in chapter 4. After the king gives his personal testimony here, we don't hear any more about King Nebuchadnezzar. He just kind of fades off the scene. He'll eventually die and pass his kingdom down to those under him. We'll cover that in a little bit. But in the meantime, Belshazzar, his grandson, takes over after just a few years. And that's in chapter 5 down here. But chronologically, chapter 7 and 8 fall between 4 and 5. So we're going to take these in a chronological order. Let's go down to chapter 7. Chapter 7, Daniel has a vision about 4 great beasts. And these 4 great beasts come up, each stronger, more terrifying than the one before. destroy the one before and take over. And then following this would be the coming of the Son of Man to set up the ultimate kingdom. Now, that was the broad vision that Daniel had there in chapter 7. So, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail in that. We go down to chapter 8, and he has more visions about these same kingdoms, because he understands these beasts represent kingdoms. He understands that the same kingdoms that the king's image dream was. Not both cases. It's kingdoms that are going to be coming from Babylon and succeeding kingdoms. But Daniel really has difficulty on putting everything together, really understanding it. So the angel Gabriel is sent to him to help him understand. And so he understands as much as possible here, but still not the total picture, and it bothered him so much. It says in verse 27, he said, Daniel was sick for days and did not fully understand the vision. So it really bothered him. But we'll come back to this later. It'll be a few years after that. But leaving chapter 8, we pick up our chronology once again of the Babylon kingdom. And now Belshazzar is king. That's his grandson. Now, as we get into this chapter, the picture I have in mind, I don't know if it's accurate, but the picture I have of Belshazzar is he grew up as just this spoiled little rich kid. And now he's an adult, and the keys to the kingdom has been handed to him. And so he's flourishing in that role as serving as king. And he throws this tremendous feast, invites 1,000 people to come to this feast. And celebrating there, he even brings out some of the implements that his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem so that they could drink wine from those. The ultimate act of defiance there. But he's in charge. He and his gods that he serves, are stronger than any other. So that's the scene that was going on here. And they're throwing this great, what I call, it's a feast, but a drunken party. They're all drinking, living it up. You can imagine what all was probably happening there. Until all of a sudden, everything stopped. And a hush comes over the place. Because there's an unattached hand writing on the banquet wall. And they were all stunned by it. Something obviously supernatural is going on, and they didn't know what. So he, once again, like his grandfather, brings in the wise men there. Some were probably there anyway, the banquet, and said, what does this mean? What's the interpretation? I mean, Belshazzar was so stunned by it, he almost faints and just, weak-kneed from seeing something like this. Of course, nobody could read the inscription or tell him what it meant. So the queen comes into the banquet hall. Now, we're not told exactly who this queen is. Obviously an older person, and some think it may be his mother. But she is an older queen. She comes in and she says, Belshazzar, remember, there's a man in your kingdom that served your father, which is grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar. And he has the ability to interpret dreams, and he could tell you what the meaning of this inscription is. So Daniel is brought in, and he sees the writing on the wall. Now, Daniel knows immediately what it says. And scholars think the reason that no one else could read it and Daniel could, it was written in Hebrew. So if that's the case, whatever the case, Daniel could read it. And so he does for the king, and you can pick that up if you want to follow, starting about verse 25. He says, this is the translation of what is written here. So many tekel, Euphrasian, or Perez is what the inscription said. And this is what it means, is that many means God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel means it has been weighed and fallen short. It did not measure up to God's standards. And Perez means that your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. All right. Unbeknownst to anyone in that banquet hall in the celebration, while all of this was going on, the enemy was making a plan to take over the kingdom. Now, they felt secure. This was a fortress they lived in. Walls too high to scale. It was everything in it. They didn't have to go out. They had food there, even had fresh water running right through the city. But the Medes and their army had a plan. They diverted the river. And when they diverted the river, it meant there was a giant tunnel right under the wall of the city. So they simply marched their army right under the wall through that tunnel, right to the banquet hall, takes over and takes the life of Belshazzar, the king of Babylon. So that's the end of the king of Babylon. They're taken over now by the Medes and the Persians. Now, Daniel serves more under Darius. You don't hear too much about Cyrus here. It's all about Darius, the Mede. So that's chapter 5. Now let's move down to chapter 6. Now that Darius has taken over, he obviously hears about Daniel and word about him and all that he has accomplished. And so he forms a pretty close bond with Daniel and allows him to serve in an important role within his kingdom. So his enemies, the non-Jews that worked for Darius, also pronounced Darius. Darius is typically the way I pronounce it. His enemies wanted to get rid of Daniel, but they couldn't come up with anything against him unless they knew if it involved his religion and his determination to serve God. They thought, that's the opening that we can use to attack Daniel. So they came up with this plan, scheme, and they put together this ordinance, regulation that said anyone who worships any god except King Darius for 30 days would be cast into the lion's den. Now, that appealed to the king because he's pretty much a typical king and that filled with pride, arrogance, and so that was something he was agreeable to. So he signed it. Meant it was a law of the Medes and the Persians that could not be changed. So when they observed Daniel going through his daily worship experience, then it was reported to Darius the king. Well, he had no choice. He knew he had been trapped. And so Daniel was then cast into the lion's den. Darius went back to his dwelling place, had a sleepless night, because he really didn't want anything bad to happen to Daniel. The next morning, he comes back to the lion's den and yells in for Daniel. I'm not sure why, thinking by some miracle, maybe he didn't die. Well, Daniel answers and says, God has protected him, and no harm had come to him. So he has Daniel taken out of the lion's den and realized that the plan these enemies of Daniel had put together, and he has them and their families cast into the lion's den. They were all destroyed. So that's the story of the lion's den and how Daniel prospers through that. And by then, Daniel's in his early 80s. This is near the end of his life. So now we go back to the other overlapping story, in chapter 9. In chapter 9, we pick up from the prophetic story from chapter 8, and he's still struggling to understand everything that's going on. And Daniel has been reflecting on the book of Jeremiah, where he realized the prophecy of this 70 years in captivity. And he realizes that the time is clicking on, and we're near the 70 years. But he sees no sign of it coming to an end, no way it's going to end, and no sign of repentance of his people that God would relent. So he's struggling. So Gabriel is sent to him to give him more clarity of what all this really means. Now, as we get to the middle of that chapter, in chapter 9, Gabriel explains to him that this pertains to the time of the end. And in other words, it's not going to be something that Daniel sees ever, really, but right away it's going to extend all the way to the time of the end. So he gives this critical prophecy that starts in verse 24 of the 70-week prophecy. So he outlines it for him, saying, basically this prophecy is for your people, the Jews. They are the ones that are being projected here. It's a history of mankind that's playing out, but it's primarily directed to focus on the Jewish people. So we start that that 4-verse outline of Daniel's 70th weeks, and I'll put up the chart again, which I think I showed last week, and that's from 445 BC to the Lord's return at the end of tribulation is the time period for Daniel's 70 weeks. Now you have another handout that we'll look at now. The other handout looks like this. And I've tried to put together some detail about the 70th week that allows you to keep up with it a little more closely than just reading through it. Well, look at the top, first of all, focus on it. And you see how it's broken down, the 70 weeks, or 7 weeks of 7, or 490 years. 69 weeks based from the decree of Artaxerxes to let the people go. That's the last decree of letting the people go back to Jerusalem. From there to the time that Jesus Christ comes and makes his triumphant entry on Palm Sunday was exactly 69 weeks, or 483 years. Okay. So then there's a gap. And this gap is where we are now, still, in this church age. Now, Daniel, I have no idea that he even knew there was a gap there. And certainly not that it was a 2,000-year gap. He expected the 70th week to start right after that, I'm sure. So the beginning point for this 7-year tribulation is when the Antichrist confirms this agreement with Israel for 7 years. That's when the clock starts ticking on that 70th week. So you can read through on your own some more of the detail there. I don't have time to go through it all. But look on down on the same handout. Some definitions there, some other verses, references I won't get into. But he says this is the purpose. It's for your people, A, to finish dealing with sin. God's pouring his wrath out during that 7-year tribulation period. And secondly, B, was to set up a messianic kingdom, prepare for it. That's the purpose of this 70 weeks. Quickly now, let's go back to our chronological walk through the book. And we get to 10 and 11, which is more prophecies, more fulfillment of, or more, not fulfillment, but understanding of what these prophecies going forward represent. Now, one of the things that makes it difficult to follow some prophecies is that some have what scholars call a dual meaning. In other words, it has a near-term fulfillment and a long-term, end-time fulfillment. And that's the case here, it's built in. We're talking about the little horns that Daniel describes, and what those represent are these two evil characters. The first one's Antiochus Epiphanes, who in about 169 BC goes into the temple in Jerusalem and sacrifices a pig. And in doing so, he defiles the Temple Mount there, the sanctuary. A similar thing will happen in the middle of the 7-year tribulation, halfway through, when the Antichrist comes along. Both these are evil characters inspired by Satan. Antiochus Epiphanes is just a forerunner of the Antichrist. The Antichrist will go into the temple, so there has to be another temple built and actually in operation at that point in time. There is none now, so there will be. And so he goes in and desecrates it and requires that everybody start worshiping him instead of God. So that's the real evil person that comes out here as just a person that follows Satan, inspired by Satan at that point in time. All right, so the reason I point that out is when it sounds confusing about who some of these characters are and who is meant by the symbols, just keep that in mind, that multiple people could be in play here. Now let's go on down to chapter 12. Whoops. Skip too far. In chapter 12, the last chapter, we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but as we get into chapter 12, Daniel is seeing how this is all going to end up. And let me read a couple verses here in chapter 12. One important verse here is verse 1. And Daniel writes here, "At that time, which is the end time, Michael shall stand up." Michael is an angel. And Revelation talks about this instance too. "But the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble," that's the tribulation, "such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time. And at that time," tribulation period now, "at that time your people shall be delivered. Everyone who's found written in the book of life." In other words, Daniel is assured when all this plays out, your people will be delivered. Because we're told in other scriptures, and we study the end time prophecies, how that at that time in Jerusalem, when Antichrist goes into the temple and turns against Israel, about a third, or we're told a third of the people will be killed. But 2/3 of the Jews will escape and be protected through the last one half of tribulation, last 3.5 years. But at that time, at the end, what we're talking about here, they will all be saved. Every Jew alive at that point will recognize Jesus Christ for who he is and be saved as a result. So that starts out the chapter. I don't have time to go through the details of it, but he spells out what's going to happen here in that end time period of tribulation. And look what happens when we get to verse 13, the last verse in the chapter, the last verse in the book of Daniel, when he says, "But you, Daniel, go your way to the end, for you shall rest, and you will rise to your inheritance at the end of days." So Daniel was told, and now he understands, he won't be around as this plays out. We're going from his life all the way to the end of time. And that's what Daniel is told. You're going to rest. In other words, you're going to die and be with the Lord. And till that time, you will rise again. You will be resurrected to live through that millennial time period that the Lord sets up, millennial kingdom. All right, so that's a quick walk through the book of Daniel. Hopefully, you have a good feel now for what this book is about, and you could explain to someone the gist of Daniel, the overall storylines in it, as I mentioned, the two different ones. But the second thing is I was going to give you some good handouts, and I've looked at some. Now I'm going to show you some other handouts we'll walk through quickly, about out of time. The first one defines the Babylonian captivity. We'll look at the top of the form. The siege of Jerusalem, the first one, 605 BC. So this is in 3 stages. That's when Daniel and some other members of the nobility were taken, along with his 3 friends. Then the second siege comes in 597, when Ezekiel and about 10,000 others are taken captive. And Ezekiel we'll get into next week, which is, he also prophesies during this period of time. Then the third one was 586 BC, and there is Jerusalem and the temple itself is completely destroyed, just as Jeremiah has said it will happen. Now, some other key events down here. The first one, I found a Jewish tradition several years ago when I put this chart together originally, that Jeremiah was eventually rescued from being captured in Egypt and brought to Babylon. I can't find anything that backs that up. That's why I put all these question marks here. Probably if I was redoing this thing, I wouldn't show that, because many scholars think that Jeremiah died in Egypt and never, of course, returned to Jerusalem. So that's the siege. Now we go to some interesting facts here about the reason for the captivity to begin with. It's because of the Sabbath, a land rest that Moses lays out in Leviticus, that this is what you're to observe, and of course if you don't observe that, then you'll suffer the consequences. So in that verse in Leviticus 23, I'll read it real quickly. 6 years you shall sow your field, And 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather its fruit. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. And so they had not done that, some 490 years apparently. And God says, the land will be resting while you're in captivity. That's when they'll have the 70 years of captivity and 70 years of resting the land. The return to Jerusalem, also in 3 parts. You have the first one in 538 BC when King Cyrus gives the decree to allow the first group, Zerubbabel and about 50,000 Jews, to go back and start rebuilding the temple. It took a couple years to get all the material together and start building it in 536. It was finished in 516. The second group was led by Ezra, about 2000 in 458, based on a decree by Artaxerxes, Persian king. The third and final one is in 445, and this is the decree by Artaxerxes to allow Nehemiah, who's Jewish cupbearer, to go back and repair the wall that had come down, been torn down around the city. So that started the 70th week. That's the one I mentioned earlier. Some more facts to keep in mind here. The return occurred, as I said, in 3 phases, as well as the captivity, the siege. It begins with a decree from King Cyrus, and then the event was prophesied by Isaiah about 100 years before Cyrus was even born, that he prophesied that by name. He named Cyrus. So God knows exactly what's going to happen. The time frame stretches out over some 150 years. It was a 70-year captivity. That was the prophecy. But by the time it all worked out, it was over 150 years. And most of the exiles in Babylon never really returned, Once you have generations grow up in a new country, then they start speaking the local language, learn their culture, and then they kind of migrate into the population. And they migrated all over the world after that. Now, how do you define the 70 years because of its stretching out? Well, there's 2 different ways that scholars define it. Some have from the first siege by Nebuchadnezzar until the beginning when they started rebuilding the temple. But I think more of them use this definition. Is from the destruction of the temple in 586 BC until the rebuilding of the temple was actually completed. But either way, the Bible doesn't strictly define that for us. But most of the exiles that I mentioned never returned. Many, according to Acts, migrated to every nation. Remember our other handout where he gave the chronology here. So keep that in mind. Remember the handouts you also have with the metallic image and what it meant. And we're out of time, but I'm going to try to cover this real quickly if you can stay with me. Another handout you have is one here called Kings and Empires and Kingdoms. And it gives us a breakdown. And the reason for this is as you're reading through Daniel and looking at all the symbols here, it's good to know what they represent, how this plays out. So I'm going to go through these 4 kingdoms real quickly, beginning with the first one, which is Babylon, from about 605 to 539. Also, I'm showing here in chapter 2, this is symbolized by different metals. In Daniel's dream, the kingdoms are symbolized by beasts. And so this will help you piece those together. Then in chapter 8, he symbolizes 2 of the kingdoms with a different animal, a ram here and with 2 horns and a male goat for Greece. So anyway, as we talk a little bit as we go through it, I'm going to go through it quickly. After Nebuchadnezzar died, his son succeeded him, and these didn't last long. There were several of those. They kept murdering each other, son-in-laws and so forth, trying to take over. All the way down to Nabonidus, which takes over about 556 BC. When he takes over, things kind of settle down. And you didn't have all this murdering other people to take over. But when Nabonidus takes over, things settle down there. Apparently, he didn't really want to continue to be involved in the day-to-day running of the kingdom and all that goes on there. So tradition says that he moved off to Arabia somewhere, built a dwelling there, and just kind of lived a life of luxury. And turned the kingdom over to his son, Belshazzar. So he wasn't technically the king, but he was second in command and served as the king. So that's the kingdom here. Knowing that information kind of helps me when I go back and read through what's happening, and you just kind of put it together a little better. You go down to the second one. The Medes and the Persians took over. And we'll hear more about Darius in Daniel than we do of Cyrus. Persia was the larger and the stronger of the two, the Medes and the Persians, but they worked together. It was really kind of a family affair. King Cyrus was the nephew of Darius. So apparently no conflict there. They worked together as one in the kingdom. So we see some of the followers of Cyrus after he's off the scene. I'm all the way down to Xerxes. Xerxes goes by the name of Ahasuerus in Esther. You recall that story. Now, some think that Xerxes was the son of Darius. So once again, you see how that, all is a kind of family affair. When we get to Xerxes, things change for the Jews. The Jews had been hated, despised for centuries ever since the Jewish nation was, or Jewish race was created. And it's true even today. You have hatred of the Jewish people, just unexplained other than the fact that Satan hates the Jews and he inspires people to hate them. But in the book of Esther, you remember that story where Mordecai, that was her uncle, I believe. But what was the guy's name? That Haman. Yeah, he tried to destroy the Jews, wanted to just wipe them out totally. And through all of that story, you learn how that turned around. And through Esther, who was a beautiful Jewish virgin that Xerxes or Ahasuerus took as wife, so married her. And through all that ordeal played out in the book of Esther, the Jews found favor, and they were given, favored status there. Changed dramatically. That might help explain how Artaxerxes, who gave 2 of the decrees to allow the Jews to come back, about him being favorable toward the Jewish people. Just some history there that might help. All right. Now let's go to the third one. Go from Medes and the Persians down to the Greek Empire. The Greek Empire here played out in chapter 8 as a goat, a powerful goat that comes against the 2-horned ram, which is Medes and the Persians, destroys it and takes over. Now this is representative of Alexander the Great we know now. Daniel didn't have all this information. It was all future to him. But now we look at much of it as history. And We understand it because of that. So when you get into this Greek Empire, Alexander the Great, probably the most fierce warrior throughout history from what we know about him. The speed and power and with which he went from nation to nation, defeating each one and taking over, it was just amazing. He took over, but at a young age, but didn't live very long. And he died I think when he was taking over everything, he was in his 20s, but then he actually died after that. Tradition says because of his living and so forth, it maybe died of a venereal disease or something and drinking himself to death. It was said that he was such a warrior that after he defeated every nation that had any resistance, that he sat down and cried because there were no more nations to conquer. That was his life. So, amazing. So once he passed on, the kingdom was split up among his 4 generals. 2 of them we don't hear much about. The 2 that we do is Seleucus in the north, in Syria, and then Ptolemy, which is in the south in Egypt. And those 2 have a lot of conflicts, as we find out through history. Coming out of the north, out of Syria, was this evil person here we talked about earlier, Antiochus Epiphanes, a forerunner of the Antichrist. So that's all I'm going to have time to talk about there. Then we go to Rome, which is the 4th one. Each nation is stronger than the one preceding it. And Rome was stronger than the ones that preceded it. They had a stronghold over the entire then-known world at that time. And, they lasted many more years than the other kingdoms had lasted. But eventually, as populations grow and nations start getting stronger all over the world, then they kind of fade away. There will be a revived Roman Empire at the time of the end during the Antichrist reign. Now you can see how the country's just, like it would have been impractical, particularly in that period of time, for a country, one kingdom, to control the entire world. It was just too vast to do it, once they grew to that point. But the revived kingdom, Roman kingdom, controlled by the Antichrist, what makes that possible is the technology that's coming about, so that everything can be controlled through computers and, a digital currency and so forth. This just makes that easier to understand how that can happen as we get to the end time. All right. After the 4th kingdom, of course, will come the kingdom we're all looking for when the Lord comes back, sets up his millennial kingdom. And that's the book of Daniel, and we're over